from victims of workplace safety accidents and the survivors, their family members. And the wall downstairs was lined with photographs of people who died on the job. And several of those people, there was a young 14-year-old boy, a 19-year-old boy, their pictures were there as well. And the aunt of one of those boys spoke to the group. And the 14-year-old, Wyatt Whitebread, who was killed in a grain bin in Illinois in 2010, the image of him is he's this blonde-haired kid. He's like smiling. He's just sort of full of life in this image, and it's his photograph that sort of haunts me and haunted me through work on this story. And NPR and the Center for Public Integrity got together pretty much as a result of the Upper Mid Branch coal mine disaster in West Virginia, where we started talking about black lung in particular. And then we started talking about doing other stories together. And we had worked on a series together that Dory mentioned on air pollution, poison places. And Jim Morris and I were talking about grain bins because there was a grain bin explosion in Kansas while we were working on poison places. And we started talking about the notion of investigating grain bin explosions. But we quickly discovered that the much more serious issue, at least in terms of ongoing entrapment, ongoing deaths, was not with explosions. That had been a problem that had largely been resolved, with the exception of this particular incident in Kansas. But the issue was really more that people were dying in grain bins that were getting sucked under, and that young people who were not old enough to be working in grain bins were being hired to work in them and sent in without proper training and equipment, and were dying. We shifted our focus to that, and we focused on this incident in Illinois because it was especially compelling. It was one of the worst incidents on record. It involved an underage worker, and the fine for the company involved, which was about $500,000 and was one of the highest fines on record up to that time, was cut by more than half. There was no criminal prosecution, either on the local level or by the U.S. Attorney's Office. It didn't appear there would be any. And so Jim and I decided to look into that in a great deal of deals in which young people were sent into grain bins illegally in terms of not being old enough to be working in them, didn't have training, didn't have safety equipment, were sent in to do something that is specifically prohibited by the law, called walking down grain. That's prohibited as a result of a death that had occurred 20 years before. And we found that the same safety violations were occurring over and over and over again, year after year after year, despite attention that some of you all had actually brought to this issue, despite the regulations that were enforced, and that what OSHA was doing during that entire time was routinely reducing the fines that were levied against these companies. We found that in the worst cases on record, in terms of the willfulness of the employers and people dying, that the fines were reduced from 40 to 97%. And in one of the 97% reduction was in probably one of the single worst cases. So there was something wrong with this system, and we decided to bring attention to it. And one of the things I think that made a difference, that helped in our story, is we had a lot of data, and we had some incidents, but there was a survivor of the incident in Illinois. And it took about 6 months to get him to talk to us. He was severely traumatized, and still is, of course. He watched his best friend die in front of him. He felt responsible because he couldn't keep the corn from filling his mouth and covering his head. And he only survived probably because he was slightly taller, and because a rescuer reached him in time and stuck a bucket around his head with the bottom cut out, which kept the corn from completely engulfing his head until they were able to get him out, which took about 7 hours. So your reaction to that, we wanted to have in our story this sense of what it was like to be engulfed in grain. And it took a lot of patience and talking with him over a long period of time, a lot of texting actually, with my guy, so we texted a lot. And he finally agreed to speak to us, and it's really what made the story much more compelling and made the whole situation much more compelling, because he described, you know, the most horrific thing that any of us would ever want to go through. And that's what this, you know, all these stories are about workers put in positions that the employer knows they're dangerous, the law requires them to act in a different way, and then all these numbers all of a sudden made sense. They were meaningful.
So what sort of reaction did you get from this series?
Well, you know, immediately we had heard through a source that OSHA sent out a sort of a verbal directive out to area directors to be more careful with reducing fines when it comes to grain bin incidents. We couldn't get them to confirm that on the record. They wouldn't talk about it. We don't know whether they really have done that. This has been a very heavy harvest year in corn country in particular. I think it's a record corn harvest. It was really wet earlier in the season, and it's possible that it was a wet corn harvest, and those are the conditions that lead to entrapments in grain bins. So we're kind of waiting to see what will happen. I would like to take another look at it maybe in a year and see what's happened with these this year. There are also members of Congress, you know, reacted strongly to it. There is legislation that would, proposed legislation that would make the law tougher, that would make it, it's a misdemeanor right now if you know, if your willful behavior causes the death of somebody in a grain bin, you know, under OSHA, under the OSHA statute, it's a misdemeanor with a maximum 6 months in jail, and federal prosecutors don't see that as necessarily something worth prosecuting. So, you know, if you drag an endangered species into the grain bin and kill that endangered species, you'd face a felony. If you know, peed in the stream or poisoned the stream outside the grain bin, it's a felony. But if you take a worker in there and the worker dies, it's only a misdemeanor. So the U.S. attorney in Illinois, who had declined to prosecute this case, said they would take a second look at it. There has been no prosecution. The local attorney, we kept, you know, asking whether they would prosecute, which is possible actually under Illinois law. They didn't prosecute. So ultimately, you know, we created awareness. We don't know if there's any sustaining response. Jim, do you have any?
I was about to ask him. No?
They're the big guys. They do federal black lung defense. They've sort of worked for the coal industry for 200 years now. And so what the firm did when they got this, first of all, I should say that Gary was not represented, which is often the case in these cases. Miners just can't find any lawyers who are willing to represent them because, you know, not only are you working on a contingency basis, but the payout is really small at the end. And then if you do win, you have to litigate against the coal company again, which I've seen that drag on for a long time. And they're just really hard to win for a number of reasons that are detailed in the stories. But anyway, so what this law firm did was they saw this pathology report, they got the slides of his lung tissue and sent it to their own doctors, who usually pretty consistently provide them the answers that they want, which is not black lung. And these two of their own doctors, they sent them the two, both said complicated black lung. So they took those reports and just kind of didn't submit them to the record, didn't tell anyone that they had them, let led everyone in the case to believe that the one from the hospital with the inflammatory pseudotumor diagnosis was the only one that existed, and based on that, he lost his case. He had to go back to the mine for almost 6 years. He rapidly deteriorated to the point where he needed a lung transplant, and he died waiting on his lung transplant. It wasn't until a couple months before his death that the law firm finally had to disclose these reports, and they're still litigating his case now, because he died 4 years ago. So after hearing that, I decided to dig into, obviously see whether that was a pattern with this law firm. Turns out it was. And so I documented a number of cases where they withheld evidence that ended up playing key roles in defeating miners' claims. And these are guys who have complicated pneumoconiosis. I mean, they're very, very sick. They a lot of times were on oxygen. I mean, it was really serious stuff. And so as I was looking at the law firm, I started seeing that there seemed to be a lot of these doctors coming up over and over again. And you would sort of expect that. In any sort of litigation context, there would be certain experts that would be typically for one side or the other. But the surprising thing about the doctors that kept popping up on one side, the coal company side, were that they were from Johns Hopkins University. And started looking at that, and it turns out there's this, it's not mentioned anywhere on their website, they don't advertise it, but there's a pneumoconiosis unit there that has existed for 40 years. And they have been basically the go-to place for getting x-rays and CT scans interpreted by coal companies. And they have a remarkable record of almost never finding black lung. And they play key roles in a lot of cases because these typically hinge on credibility determinations. And if you've got, you know, a doctor in the coal fields versus someone at Johns Hopkins who went to Harvard and has been at a leadership position at Hopkins for 40 years, they usually win. So that's what's happened in a lot of these cases. So those were kind of the main thrusts of the stories that had the biggest impact. And I think, so 2 days after the Hopkins piece came out, Johns Hopkins actually suspended that unit's work on black lung cases. They're pending an internal review, so we'll see what happens with that. We have asked them. They have kindly not responded, as they have kindly not responded throughout this process. But then, of course, we've got people in Congress are pretty outraged about this, as are some people at the Labor Department. A couple of senators are drafting legislation. They just literally the stories next to their notes, and they're saying, you know, where are the holes? What do we need to? How do we fix the benefits program? There are a lot of things they're looking at. The Labor Department is assisting them. NIOSH is not happy either because this involves the B-Reader program, and so they have offered their assistance to Johns Hopkins if they choose to take that. And then two congressmen also called for an investigation by the Labor Department's Inspector General into all of this, and they will not confirm whether they have launched an investigation or not.
Great. Anything else you'd like to include about this series?
It's been really amazing, the reaction to it, and probably the most gratifying thing is hearing from, you know, getting calls from miners or widows, and you know, saying, you know, thank you, and I think one of my favorite stories was there was a miner who I heard this from a lawyer. I mean, these cases are playing out now, and there's kind of people are trying to figure out what happens now that I have an opinion from Johns Hopkins? And so they're drawing them, and the judges have apparently during a hearing the other day, out of the blue, kind of came up with questioning the veracity of some of the Johns Hopkins guys. But one of my favorite stories was this minor who was unable to find a lawyer actually showed up in court with the stories, and it was really to discredit the doctors. And the judge apparently laughed and said that she was well aware of the situation. So that's sort of the reaction that we hope for in these things. It's rare, but I mean, it's really, like I said, the gratifying thing has been seeing how this is, you know, I hope helped minors who deserve to win their claims actually do that.
About a year ago, we published a story in conjunction with WBEZ, which is the public radio station in Chicago. And as Dory mentioned, it involved a man named Carlos Centeno. Mr. Centeno came to Chicago from Mexico in 1994. He worked as a bartender, a newspaper delivery man, and a forklift driver before he was laid off in 2010. So he signed on with a temporary staffing service and was sent to a factory near Midway Airport that makes household and personal care products. One day in November 2011, Mr. Centeno was scalded by a 185-degree solution of water and citric acid that erupted from a 500-gallon chemical tank he was cleaning. He wore no protective gear other than rubber boots and latex gloves. He was in a t-shirt. He was burned over 80% of his body. That the accident happened was bad enough, certainly. What made it worse was the employer's behavior after Mr. Centeno had been burned and was screaming for help. Managers at this factory, which is called the Ronnie Corporation, perhaps because they were afraid of alerting OSHA, refused to call 911. Mr. Centeno, as a result of that, arrived at a burn unit 98 minutes after the accident, which may have cost him his life. A frustrated co-worker had first taken him to a local clinic where nurses immediately grasped the severity of his injuries and called an ambulance. Mr. Centeno died 3 weeks later. We interviewed his family. His son, Carlos Jr., told me, quote, "It's just wrong what happened. They were not thinking of him as a human being." The key to the story, I think, apart from interviewing the family, was that I was able to obtain an 11-page internal OSHA memo, which recommended criminal prosecution of this company, Ronnie. That hasn't happened yet, unfortunately. But in that memo, the OSHA enforcement chief painted a vivid picture of conditions inside the plant. Workers handled high-temperature liquids with no real protective gear. Even serious injuries went unreported. Workers who were hurt were warned to be...
My name is Tim Bell. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning, Tim.
Buenos dias a todos.
Buenos dias.
Chicago Workers Collaborative works closely with temp workers. We're an association of temp worker members throughout the Chicago region. There's about 300,000 temp workers who work in places like Ronnie, making shampoo, packing shampoo, food processing, beauty products, printing. Every industry has temp workers. And the case of Carlos Centeno is typical because when a temp worker is injured, the company does not see itself as responsible for that injury. They see the temp company as responsible for the injury. In this case, it was a company called Ron Staffing. Ron Staffing has many injuries, so many injuries that they cannot even get worker comp insurance anymore. They're self-insured through a a phony insurance company, which is now being investigated thanks to this story by the Illinois Worker Comp Commission. And there's a very good chance, my understanding is that the Attorney General is going to indict Ron's owners criminally for not having worker comp insurance. Since that time, many other stories, reporters have picked up on the issues in Chicago, in New Jersey, in Massachusetts. Other media sources have followed up, doing more in-depth different angles on the temp industry and the pernicious way that workers are treated as inhuman cups that are just disposable, thrown away, the way that Carlos Santana was thrown away. A wrongful death suit is still pending. It's worth millions of dollars that Ronnie can pay. Ronnie Corporation is trying to hide its assets, so they've sold the company to other family members. The owners are South Asians, they have extended family, and they're able to move their assets among family members. The OSHA investigation is ongoing. The owners of Ron's Staffing continue to treat their workers the same way. Workers are injured, they're left at the factory. The factory calls Ron's, what do we do with them? Oh, send them to our clinic. 45 minutes later, after bleeding or having his skin melting off his body, he shows up at Ron's company clinic. And the company clinic then decides what to do with them. The whole purpose of this is for big, huge companies which sell products by Ronnie, which fabricate most of the consumer items that we're gonna even trade over Christmas with each other, to lower their costs, their labor costs. And this issue of health and safety is one which I believe is the Achilles heel of the temp industry. If we can get workers to report injuries, to talk to the media, to expose the story like they did in the jungle, in the south side of Chicago, where our office is actually located, we can make a change here, together. The pressure from the media puts pressure on government agencies put pressure on companies. Spanish language media is picking up on these stories. National Univision has done a couple of series on temp workers. Temp workers are watching this, and they're thinking, yes, we have an organization. We have a way to fight this.
Shows that, and this is something you all know because this is what you do all the time, but I think most other Americans aren't aware of it. We rely on government agencies to protect workers. There are a set of laws which may or may not be effective. There's a regulatory agency that may be enforcing the law and may not be paying attention to the right things. And what we as reporters do is we look for where the inequities exist, where the wrongs happen. And often, as you all know, these workers don't, have voices. If they're temp workers, who's representing them? If they're coal miners and they're in a non-union mine, who's representing them? And sometimes even if they're in a union mine, do they get the right kind of attention? Or can the union be effective in dealing with mine owners who refuse to pay attention to the law? And it falls then back to the regulatory agency. And what we've done in each of these cases is we've looked at what the law says and determined whether or not the law is strong enough to deal with these situations. And we've looked at how the regulatory agencies have responded and tried to figure out whether they're responding appropriately. And we've exposed, in each of these stories, we've exposed weaknesses in the law and weaknesses in the regulatory system. It's easy to blame the companies for what we might consider to be greed, taking shortcuts, whatever it is. But they're also is a system of laws and regulation that's supposed to keep them, keep them in check. And responsibilities of the companies involved, but we've also looked at the regulations and the laws. I think that's, so what we try to do is we take it to another level, and we try to give the workers involved, a voice in the sense that this is what happened to them, we're telling their story, and then we're taking it further to how the law protects or doesn't protect them and how the agency.
The first thing that they tell you in journalism school is, voice to the voiceless. That's what you're supposed to be. That's probably nowhere is that more true than in the labor sector, because in all the areas I've covered, I've never found comparable instances of people with just really no recourse, no place to go to. A lot of the miners that I talked to just had they were just completely hopeless. I think it's our job to sort of, make people, the wider public, look at things that make them uncomfortable. Like, what happened to Carlos Centeno, or, a coal miner just slowly suffocating to death in his home. That's, a lot of times, you all know about some of the stuff that's happening, but the larger public doesn't, and so our job is to bring that story, I think, to the people in power, and they can't ignore it once it's there. And I think you see that with all these stories, is that these are things, people know, you all know that things like what happened in the Centeno case, or what I wrote about, or what Howard has worked on. You know that goes on, but it's once you force people to look at that, the outrage is there. So I would encourage everyone to talk to us and tell us those things that sort of seem axiomatic to you, but maybe would be surprising to the general public, because sometimes just a little light makes a lot of difference.
And how would you like people to get in touch with you, to be able to highlight the stories of the workers that people are working with on the ground level?
Yeah, my contact information is on the website. I can share with anyone. I'm Hamby@publicintegrity.org. My phone number is online, so by all means, contact me with tips, personal stories.
Certainly we look for compelling stories or outrageous stories, and Carlos Centeno obviously falls into that category. But we also look for stories that make a larger point. It can't just be, I think Chris would agree with this too, it can't just be, a strong story. It needs to make a larger point. So in the case of Centeno, the larger point was, there are 2.5 million temp workers in this country who are at extreme risk of injury or illness because they're not treated properly. Same thing with Chris's Black Lung series, same thing with the Grain Bin series. So compelling stories, but also stories that make a bigger point.
It's not an easy, like if a reporter went to just some random temp worker and started talking to him about, tell us what's going on in the company, they're not going to get an interview. It's up to the organizers and the organizations that are working with temp workers to give them the power to feel that they can speak on camera, that they can show their face, that they don't have to be afraid of the retaliation, because the community and the organizations are going to stand behind them in the fight for justice. So as a series of reports came out after the public integrity series, literally we had to have like a good 35 workers prepped to talk to media, because media don't want to talk to the same worker again and again and again. There needs to be a different worker for each story. And that's a huge challenge for an organization to do, because again, these are workers that don't want to show their face. So the more that we can do to bring up the voiceless, to feel the power that they can speak out about the injustices, then I think these sorts of stories can happen.
It is extremely difficult to get people who are working to talk to reporters for obvious reasons. And so we do look to people like you all and others who can kind of be guides or can connect us. We call them lawyers, that sort of thing. It is a tough thing. The easiest thing is, the saddest thing is it's often easier to talk to the family once the worker's dead, because there's no job to lose anymore, and the family feels lost and wants somebody to talk to. But that's one thing, is helping us connect. I think the other really important element about all these stories and what we're really looking for is that being able to gather the data that's sort of buried in government records, and Chris is really tops at this and played a role in these stories on this. That we have been putting a new face on some of these issues with the data, exhaustive data work. The work that Chris did on Black Home took a year. And very time-consuming, it's labor-intensive, it's difficult, it's complicated, but part of what we end up doing, and the only thing I'll mention about a story I'm working on, is we are looking at government data in a way that the government has never looked at. And we are putting together different pieces of information in ways that they've never looked at before, and all the safety advocates we've talked to, they're all saying, I've never seen anything like this before. And it's giving them the that we represent nonprofit news organizations that are doing this work. And our news organizations, this is sort of a new model, and there are other nonprofit news organizations around the country focusing specifically on investigative reporting. And NPR has a commitment to doing that. We have an investigative unit, we have a staff of people doing it. There still is a healthy amount of investigative reporting and reporting of this type going on around the country. Among newspapers, it's harder because they're struggling, but there still is a healthy amount of investigative reporting and reporting of this type going on around the country. Among newspapers, it's harder because they're struggling, but there still are, and the way I see it is we're competing with them for awards, So you see who won these awards, and it's amazing work that's being done out there by local television stations in many markets around the country, by newspapers that are still, they're laying off people, but there's still determined reporters and editors of those papers doing these stories. We have this new model of nonprofit journalism. Well, it's an old model for NPR. It's a new model for organizations like the Center for Public Integrity. Well, you guys have done it for 30 years, actually, right? 25 years. So that's one way. There's still some of us out there, trying to do it. The only thing that makes it sustainable, by the way, I'm not turning this into a pledge drive. 1-800. But what makes it sustainable, really what's key, we reach out to foundations, we reach out to corporations, we reach out to anybody who will give us money without strings attached. But we depend on average people too to support what we're doing, and it.
Media outlets to partner with us. Chris's Black Lung series that he talked about was done with ABC News, for example. We worked with NPR now, 3 or 4 times, 3 or 4 projects. So it's slowly getting out there. And if you have a strong enough story, like Chris's, for example, even the networks will buy it. So that's one way to get this to a broader audience.
They wanted to see how important investigative reporting was to our listeners and to the readers on our website. And so they put at the bottom of the web story, and it was a really long web story. We really wrote a lot of stuff. And there were complaints from the web people about how long it was. So at the bottom of the story, tucked into like a tagline that was smaller print than everything else, was a little thing that said, if you'd like to comment about what you thought about this story, please click on this link. Over 700 readers clicked on that link, which astonished all of us. Clicked on that link and filled out a survey that was like 12 pages long. I mean, it was just page after page after page, filling out the survey about the story. What did you think of it? What did it lack? What really caught your attention to it? Is this important? Should NPR be doing this? And the astonishing thing about it was not only that all these people went through it, but 90% of them said that this is what's missing for them in news reporting everywhere and on NPR, and that this is what we should be doing. And that, what the most impressive thing was that more than 90% said they took action in response to the story. Now, action included, they mentioned it to somebody else. They sent it out on Facebook, they tweeted it, they called their congressman, they called the agency. There was a whole range of possibilities. But this really showed my editors, oh, he spent all this time, he spent all this money, he spent so much time in West Virginia, his daughter qualifies for the state tuition now. This is worth it, there is impact. So it helps if you respond. I mean, if you know, spread it around, and don't hesitate to let us know, you know, that what we've done is something that's useful. That's really important.
That's wonderful.